Hello everyone, welcome to this session. Now we are into session number 22nd and the topic for our discussion is Tradition and the Individual Talent, written by T.S. Eliot. So what we will be doing in this session is to look into the first part of his essay where Eliot discusses about his concept of tradition. So the main objective of this particular session is to look into the first part where Eliot explains the concept of tradition. So at the end of this session, students should be able to understand what is Eliot's concept of tradition and what is his conception of historical sense when he says that a poet should have historical sense to belong to the great tradition, and we will also understand what exactly tradition implies to and what exactly it does not implies to. So these are some important issues we discuss in this particular session, that is session number 22, and we look into first part of the essay. As I have already explained in my earlier session that this essay was first published in the year 1919 in a literary journal called Egoist, and later in the year 1921 it was first published in the first book of criticism by T.S. Eliot called as The Sacred Oath. And in this essay, it's a brief essay, Eliot divides this essay into three parts. The first part deals about the concept of tradition. The second part, it discusses the concept of impersonality in the poetry, and the third part is the conclusion. So here in this essay, Eliot discusses his views on poetry and the importance of tradition. Okay, so if you want to sum it up in one simple sentence, you can say that in this essay, Eliot discusses his views on poetry and the importance of tradition. So these are some of the major issues which he discusses in this essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent. So now we look into the part 1 where Eliot he discusses the concept of traditions. Okay. So in the very beginning of his essay, Eliot clearly mentions about the significance of tradition. So what he says is that nowadays, maybe in the beginning of the 20th century, which particular period he is referring to, that the people, they look into tradition in a disapproving way. This is something problematic for him. So what has happened in this modern period, that tradition is seen with negative connotations such as old, outdated, something to be left and something to be neglected by the new contemporary writers. But Eliot is totally opposite to this particular view. He says that in a situation when people are looking into a kind of disapproval towards tradition, the old tradition, it is important that people appreciate poet, and he says that people in the present scenario, they appreciate the poet for the newness he or she brings in and what makes him or her different from others. So this is the situation in which he writes this essay, that the tradition is seen as through some negative connotations and in a disapproving way, and the quality of the poet is judged on the basis of how new he is and what newness he or she brings into his poetry, his or her poetry. But here what Eliot says, that this has to be questioned. What is important according to him, that a poet should belongs to a great tradition of poetry, that is the ancient tradition. He should look into his predecessors, he should look into his ancestors, he should look into the earlier poets to take inspiration from them and to make sure that he has reflections of those poets in his contemporary poetry. So, when we say the poet, the contemporary poet should have reflections of earlier poets, it is not about copying it, it is about having reflections or to see the similar impact on the reader. That is what important according to T.S. Eliot. So, how he defines his conception of tradition. So, if a poet has to become a part of the great tradition, so what are the things one must keep in mind? So, what Eliot says that tradition does not mean a blind adherence to the ways of previous generations. So, he makes it clear in the very first part that tradition does not mean blind adherence to the ways of previous generation. So, it does not mean that a poet should blindly accept whatever which has been written so far, but it is a conscious effort on the part of the writer to become the part of this tradition, and I will choose what is right and what is good so that it reflects in his contemporary poetry. So, how he can become a part of this tradition? So, it is not something which can be inherited. So, tradition cannot be inherited. So, what he says that it can only be obtained by hard labor. So, it takes effort on the part of the poet to become part of this great tradition. So, how he can become part of this great tradition? So, as you can see, when he says, Eliot says, tradition can only be obtained by a poet when he or she has the knowledge of historical sense. This is very significant, this is very important in the essay. The tradition can only be obtained by those who have historical sense. So, it is a very direct statement where Eliot is suggesting a person can become part of the great tradition only when he or she has the knowledge of history. So, what is his concept of historical sense? This is what we must understand here. So, according to Eliot, tradition involves historical sense, which compels the poet to write not merely with his own generation in his bones, but with a feeling that all past literature of Europe and Homer is within him. So, this is one statement which he makes in his essay, that when a poet has historical sense, which makes that poet to write not merely with the knowledge of his present generation, but he writes with a feeling, such a feeling that where he thinks that all of the past literature of Europe, maybe the literature created by the great Greek writer Homer, yes, it is within himself. That is like internalizing the earlier literature, the earlier poetry within oneself to have this historical sense. And it is this historical sense what makes the writer part of the great tradition, and it is more important than making himself or calling himself or herself as an individual poet. So, it is this very knowledge of history, the great tradition of poetry which has been created so far by his ancestors, by his earlier poets, which makes him part of this great tradition. And what is significance? What is significant here is to understand the fact that a writer should become part of this great tradition rather than, yes, individual poet. So, Eliot here distinguishes the knowledge and the talent of an individual from the knowledge and talent of a person when he becomes a part of great tradition. So, according to Eliot, becoming the part of this tradition is more important rather than highlighting himself or herself as an individual poet. So, historical sense refers to poet should have sense of history of poetry. So, you remember this concept clearly because it is a very important aspect of his essay. Okay. Continuing his argument about concept of tradition. So, what Eliot says that the sense of tradition implies that a poet should recognize about the continuity of literature. So, here a poet should understand that you cannot or restrict poetry into strict compartments, that this particular poetry belongs to this particular period, this particular genre, or created by these particular group of writers in a particular historical context. But a poet should recognize the fact that literature is something continuous, or he should believe in the fact that continuity of literature. And tradition implies that a critical judgment as to which of the writers of the past continued to be significant even in the present. So, a poet should understand, as I have already explained when I explained about the concept of historical sense, that one should have critical judgment about what and all poetry of the past is significant even in the present. So, a poet should have knowledge of the significant writers, and this knowledge is obtained by him through hard labor. So, it is a painstaking effort, it is not an easy effort, it takes effort from the part of the poet to have this knowledge of the past. On the other hand, Eliot here, that he also says that historical sense does not mean to know the past as a whole without any discrimination. Okay. And he also said that the poet should know only a few poets whom he admires, a particular age or a period which he or she likes, and this is a sign of immaturity and inexperience. Okay. So, this is a very significant idea which he put forth here. Yes, the poet agrees to become the part of tradition, and he has to understand what is this tradition through his hard labor, and in this process the poet should not commit this mistake of knowing only few poets whom he admires, or to look into a particular age or period which he or she likes. So, this is a kind of immaturity on the part of the poet. It shows his or her inexperience. So, what Eliot suggests here, that a poet should look at the great tradition of poetry as whole. He should not restrict himself or herself to few writers, or he should not restrict himself or himself to a particular age or to a particular period. So, according to Eliot, the most valuable parts of a poet's work are those in which dead poets, his ancestors, assess their immortality most vigorously. So, to finally to put all these concept of tradition and historical sense, Eliot in his essay he says this, that a great poet or great poetry is one where dead poets, his ancestors, assert their immortality most vigorously, most openly, and most influentially. So, he is giving importance to that great tradition when he says the dead poets should assert themselves immortally and vigorously. It means that when a 20th century poet writes something, he or she should have the reflections of great writers such as William Wordsworth, William Shakespeare, and the kind of literature produced by the great stalwarts should reflect in the contemporary poetry of the contemporary poet. Okay, so, this is very significant. And then continuing with his concept of tradition, Eliot says that tradition is something which is dynamic. So, it is opposite of what is being static, because most of the time what happens when we speak of tradition, we associate with one particular period where things stop at one particular part of history. So, it becomes static at that point of time. But what Eliot explains in this essay, that tradition is not static, it has not stopped at one particular period of time. Actually, a tradition is something dynamic. So, he comes up with his dynamic conception of tradition, which he explains in the first part of this essay. So, he says that tradition is not anything fixed and static. It is constantly changing, growing, and becoming different from what it is. So, as I have already explained about the importance of continuity of literature, The same thing has been explained in this part also, when the essayist T.S. Eliot says that tradition need not be static at one particular period. It is not fixed and static. It is constantly changing, growing and becoming different from what it is. It's a very wonderful statement. So, tradition keeps on changing. It will not fix itself to one particular period. So, a poet should be aware of this fact that tradition keeps changing, because the past and present both are, yes, influential over one another. So, when a new work is created in the contemporary period, the whole literary tradition of the past is modified. This is what Eliot says. So, the contemporary work modifies the earlier literary tradition. So, the relationship between the past and the present is not one-sided, actually it is reciprocal. Yes, it is not one-sided. So, here let me bring in the concept of binaries by Jacques Derrida, where he says that in modern world we should not create binaries, that old versus new, yes, high versus low literature. Let us not create binaries. So, here Eliot may be suggesting the same thing, that the relationship between the past and the present, the two binaries, need not be seen as in the terms of superior and inferiority, where one is made superior over inferior, because we have been making the mistake, either we make the past superior over the present or the present superior over the past. But he says that it is reciprocal, it is complementary to each other, because the past directs the present and it itself modified and altered by the present. So, the past earlier tradition has its influence on the present. On the other hand, the present itself gets modified because of the earlier tradition, that is past. So, what you must understand in this particular part of the essay, that the very concept of tradition is dynamic in its nature. It will not stop at one particular period of history, because past will have influence on the present and present also alters the past tradition. So, they are not binaries where one is made superior over the other, instead they are complementary to each other. So, in the same part of the essay, Eliot, he tells about the function of tradition. So, the work of the art of the poet in the present is to be compared and contrasted with the past, works of the past. A poet is judged by the standards of the past, and Eliot wants poet to merge his personality with the earlier tradition. So, that is what he meant when he says the work of art of the poet in the present is to be compared and contrasted with the works of the past. And this judgment, when you are comparing and contrasting, again coming to the same point which we discussed earlier when we looked into the concept of tradition as dynamic, that one should not be a judgmental here, that is to come to the conclusion that this is good or this is bad, because the comparison is for knowing the facts about the new works of what. It is not to weigh and judge and make one particular work good and the other particular work bad. Instead, we must understand the comparison we do is to make sure that we will find out new facts about the new works of art. So, this is what one must keep in mind, and the comparison is for the purpose of analysis and for forming better understanding of the new. So, very important point which Eliot highlights here, that the comparison we do when we weigh the present scenario with the earlier tradition, we do it for the sake of better understanding of the new, rather than not to reject the earlier tradition. So, Eliot, he clearly wants the poet to merge himself or herself, his or her personality, with the great tradition. So, these are some of the important factors or important aspects which Eliot discusses in the first part of his essay, where he explains his conception of tradition. So, to sum up what exactly he is trying to suggest here, that a poet should belongs to the great tradition. So, tradition should not be neglected, because when people look at tradition in a disapproving way, the contemporary poet must understand the fact that he or she belongs to the great tradition, and they should make sincere effort, painstaking effort to become part of this tradition. So, how can they become part of this tradition? That is by having the knowledge of history, which he calls as historical sense of history. So, a poet should understand when he or she is writing that he has been influenced by the earlier concepts which were created by his ancestors, and he should have the knowledge of the earlier poets, the earlier poetry, the earlier genre of poetry. While doing that, he should not look into one particular age, or he should not look into his favorite writers. He should be very objective, very critical in his approach, where he should be open minded in understanding the fact that all the poets of earlier tradition, they have influence on the present, and tradition is dynamic, it is not static, it keeps changing, because past has influence over the present, and present can also alter the earlier tradition. So, the binaries have to be seen as complementary to each other. This is what Eliot suggests in this first part of the essay, tradition and the individual talent. Hope it is useful for you. So, in the next session, we will look into the second part of the essay, where he explains about the theory of impersonality in poetry. That is also a very important part in the essay that we will do in the next session. Thank you.